3 identical baskets of tomatoes. No fridge, no ice, no electricity. I placed one in a clay pot buried in wet sand, one in a wooden box buried 3 feet underground, and one in a metal crate submerged in a spring-fed trough. I checked the thermometers every morning for 7 days. One of them stayed 20 degrees colder than my kitchen, and it's not the one you think. I live off-grid every summer. I lose food to heat. So I tested 3 zero-electricity coolers from history. A pot-in-pot, an underground box, and a spring-fed trough for exactly 1 week. One kept food 20 degrees colder than my kitchen. But the real story is why it worked, and it starts with an Egyptian pharaoh's tomb around 3,700 years ago. A tomb painter in Thebes brushed a figure onto limestone. A servant holding 2 porous clay jars, one inside the other, with wet sand between. The pharaohs had no refrigerators. They had evaporation. The principle hasn't changed. When water evaporates, it steals heat from whatever it touches. If you place a damp clay pot inside a larger, slightly larger pot filled with wet sand, the inner vessel can drop to a temperature that spoils nothing for weeks. My first cooler followed that same blueprint to the millimeter, but the pot-in-pot isn't the only design that survived. In Persia, wind catchers pulled air across shallow water basins, cooling pantries without a single moving part. In medieval Europe, every homestead had a root cellar, a pit dug deep enough to ride the constant underground temperature of 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round without a compressor. And across Appalachia, spring houses tucked into hillsides used groundwater's steady 45 to 50 degrees. 3 mechanisms, 1 physics textbook, and I assumed 1 clear winner. I gave each method the exact same test. Same tomatoes, same peaches, same leafy greens, same morning shade, a calibrated data logger in the center of each basket. And then I checked the numbers every sunrise. By the second day, the pot-in-pot had already lost the lead I'd expected. The buried box was holding steady, but the spring trough was climbing. And by day 4, the cooler I'd written off as a museum piece had pulled 8 degrees below its nearest competitor. The one I'd have bet my savings on was barely beating a kitchen counter. Something was wrong. Not with the coolers, with the assumptions. And that's what led me to a buried detail in a 1930s agricultural bulletin that none of the modern survival channels ever mention. I found it in a 1934 USDA Farmers Bulletin titled Farm Storage of Vegetables. Page 17, 1 paragraph. It described a cooler I had never seen on any prepper channel, any off-grid blog, or any YouTube tutorial. A buried wooden box, lined with clay, vented through a 3-inch pipe that ran from a shaded intake under the porch up to a chimney above the soil. Not a root cellar, not a spring house. The bulletin called it a convection crib, and the claim buried in that sentence was so specific it stopped me cold. 40 degrees Fahrenheit in August. 40. That's refrigerator temperature. No ice, no compressor. Just physics and a shovel. By day 2 of my test, I already knew my expected winner was dead. The pot-in-pot, the Egyptian design I'd bet on, had barely dropped 6 degrees below the morning air. The problem wasn't the clay, it was the humidity. Wet sand between the pots can only pull heat when the water actually evaporates. And in my climate, the air was already so moist the evaporation rate had collapsed. The inner temperature hovered at 72 degrees, while I'd been promised 55. The spring trough fared better at first. The metal crate sat in 30 gallons of moving water, and the first 2 days it held 58 degrees. But the water source was a shallow creek, not a true spring. By noon on day 3, the water had soaked up enough sun to become a tepid bath, and the trough lost its advantage. By day 4, both the pot-in-pot and the spring box were within a few degrees of the shade outside. Only the buried wooden box was still dropping. That's when I noticed the detail I'd dismissed as a flaw. When I built the box, I repurposed an old shipping crate. One of the boards had a knot that had fallen out, leaving a hole the size of a quarter. I'd stuffed it with a rag, thinking it would let in warm air, but the rag had slipped. Now, that hole sat exactly where the bulletin said. The intake should be low on the north side, in permanent shade. The chimney above was a cracked PVC pipe I'd hammered into the lid for a temperature probe. I hadn't designed a convection crib. I had stumbled onto one by accident, and it was pulling cold air through the soil and exhausting the warm air out the top, exactly the way the 1934 bulletin described. I pulled the rag out completely in 4 hours. The internal temperature dropped another 6 degrees by sunrise on day 5. The data logger read 43 degrees. The pot-in-pot had climbed back to 74. The spring trough sat at 66, and a box in the dirt with nothing but a hole and a pipe was keeping food at a temperature that could preserve milk, meat, and leafy greens for days. The food inside was crisp. The tomatoes were firm. The peaches still had chill. But here is the thing. That bulletin wasn't just a forgotten footnote. It was the tip of a much larger system. The convection crib wasn't an isolated invention. It was part of a whole architecture of passive cooling that American farm families used before rural electrification. And it could be built for less than the cost of a used cooler at a yard sale. And when I dug further, I found a community that never stopped building them. They didn't need the bulletin because they'd never lost the knowledge. They were keeping it alive in barn conversations and handwritten notebooks, and one of them agreed to show me how it's done. His name was Elias, 72 years old, 4th-generation dairy farmer, lived in the same stone house his great-grandfather built in 1883. The house had no central air, no electric refrigerator until 1964, and a basement that stayed cold enough to hang meat in July. When I told him about the convection crib, he laughed. "Son," he said, "we just called it the cold hole. Every farm in this valley had one." Then he walked me to a patch of shade behind his equipment barn and pointed at the ground. There was nothing visible but a flat wooden hatch, half buried in leaves. He pulled it open. Steps, worn smooth, led 6 feet down into a chamber that smelled like damp stone and fresh soil. The walls were mortared fieldstone. The floor was raw earth, and along the north wall, a narrow shaft rose up through the soil and emerged 30 feet away behind a lilac bush. Intake low, chimney high, same design, same physics. He had built it in 1959 with his father, using the same plan his grandfather had used in 1901. He didn't have a data logger. He had a thermometer nailed to a beam, and when I shined my flashlight on it, it read 41 degrees. Outside, it was 89. The man had been running a refrigerator that consumed 0 watts for 65 years, and he'd never thought of it as anything special. Then he showed me something I didn't expect. Above the main chamber, separated by a floor of split logs, was a second room, only 4 feet high, lined with shelves of raw cedar. He called it the butter room. The air from the cold hole rose through the logs, and because the second chamber sat closer to the surface, but still shaded by 2 feet of soil and the barn wall, it settled at exactly 52 degrees. Not cold enough for milk, but perfect for butter. cheese, eggs, and wine. 2 chambers, 2 temperatures, 1 passive system, no moving parts. I asked him why he thought the knowledge had disappeared. He didn't hesitate. Rural electrification. He was 16 when the power lines reached their road in 1957. The county agent came door to door with brochures from General Electric, Frigidaire, Westinghouse. Trade in your icebox, they said. Modernize. And within 5 years, almost every farm in the area had a refrigerator. The cold holes were filled in, covered over, forgotten. His father kept theirs because he was stubborn, and because he remembered the winter of 1934, when the river froze and the ice house ran empty, and the cold hole was the only thing that kept a side of beef from spoiling. The power grid had given them convenience, but it had also given them a single point of failure. One ice storm, one downed line, one August brownout, and every freezer in the county became a clock ticking towards spoilage. Elias had lived through 3 extended outages in his lifetime, the most recent in 2012, a derecho that cut power for 11 days. While his neighbors drove their generator-purchased ice blocks from the gas station 40 minutes away, Elias simply carried his perishables down those steps and closed the hatch. But even Elias didn't know the full extent of what I'd found next, because when I searched for convection cribs in the historical record, I found a pattern. The USDA promoted these designs aggressively from 1910 to 1935. Then, abruptly, they stopped. The bulletins were pulled from print. The extension agents stopped teaching them, and in 1942, the War Production Board issued a conservation order that limited civilian refrigerator production, but by the time the war ended, the marketing machinery of the appliance industry had already rewritten the story. The cold hole wasn't just forgotten. It was actively replaced by a narrative that cooling food required a compressor, a plug, and a monthly bill. And that narrative held for almost a century, until a 72-year-old dairy farmer pulled back a hatch and proved it was never true. At the end of 7 days, the numbers laid out a verdict I couldn't ignore. My kitchen sat at a brutal 88 degrees. The pot had sputtered to 72. The spring trough held at 66. But the buried box, the convection crib I'd built wrong and then fixed with a missing knot and a cracked pipe, had locked in at 43 degrees for the final 3 days. 43. That meant the gap between my kitchen counter and the cold hole was 45 degrees. The tomatoes inside were still firm enough to snap. The peaches had a chill, like they'd just been pulled from a refrigerator drawer. The spinach had 0 wilt, and I hadn't paid a power company a single cent. The physics behind it was not a mystery. It was printed in that 1934 bulletin that almost nobody had opened in 90 years. And it was echoed in the walls of Elias's basement. 6 feet down, the soil temperature across most of North America maintains a steady 45 to 55 degrees year-round. That's the baseline, the Earth's thermal battery. The convection tube transforms that stable baseline into a slow, continuous breath. The intake, shaded and low, drinks the coolest air. The chimney, even if it's just a stub of pipe, exhales the warm. No humidity requirement. No moving water that can heat up by noon. No clay that fails when the air is thick. Just a temperature differential and a narrow column of still air doing the work. Here is what unsettled me most. The pot is a marvel, and in the dry heat of sub-Saharan Africa, it can save lives. But in the humid climate where I live, and where roughly half the world's population lives, it's nearly worthless. For years I had watched survival channels and off-grid forums elevate the clay pot cooler, as the ultimate primitive refrigerator, never once mentioning that its performance collapses above 40% humidity. The method that actually worked in my own backyard had been sitting in a USDA publication and in the memory of a dairy farmer who never threw anything away, while the rest of us bought expensive coolers and ice packs and generators. But the real surprise came when I overlaid the humidity graphs from my data loggers. The convection crib wasn't only cooling food, it was passively regulating moisture. The air pulled through the soil carried just enough humidity to prevent the vegetables from desiccating, but not so much that it encouraged mold. The pot-in-pot had turned half my test basket into a soggy mess by day 5. The spring trough had beads of condensation pooling at the bottom, which rotted the bottom layer of peaches. The buried box maintained a balance I couldn't recreate with any manual method, steady at 85% humidity. No drips, no rot. Elias didn't need a graph to know this. He'd lived it. He told me his grandmother used to store cabbages in their cold hole in October and pull them out crisp in March, as if the ground had simply paused time. The man had been running a 0-watt refrigerator since before the moon landing, and he didn't understand why anyone would pay a monthly bill to mimic what the dirt beneath their boots already provided for free. I didn't have a good answer for him, because there isn't one. Now, I'm not going to pretend that everyone can dig a 6-foot chamber tomorrow, but I am going to say this. The story we were sold about refrigeration was shaped by a century of appliance marketing, not by the limits of physics. The convection crib can be built for less than the price of a used Dawn fridge, with materials from any hardware store. It will keep food cold for as long as soil exists beneath you. I tested 3 ways to keep food cold without electricity. One clearly won. But the real winner wasn't a cooler. It was a piece of knowledge that 4 generations of my own family lost the moment the power lines reached their road, and that I only got back because a 72-year-old farmer pulled back a hatch and showed me what his father had refused to bury. Before I give you the exact plans, I need to know one thing from you. Which of these 3 methods would you actually build? Drop a comment. I read every single one, and your answers shape what I test next. If this video challenged the way you think about refrigeration, hit subscribe. We're just getting started. And if the ideas in this video made sense to you, there's a special offer from a partner who supports this channel. You'll find the link in the first pinned comment. It's something I use myself, and I think you'll like it. The cold hole sat under our feet the whole time. Someone just had to remember to look down.